On the morning of March 14th, 1857, beneath the Doric portico of the Richmond Exchange, a single human life was sold for a sum that, by our reckoning, would be the equivalent of nearly $400,000. The gavel fell 17 times before an invisible tally was finally accepted, and when the final sound echoed across the marble, 3 men in the crowd crumpled to the floor as if struck. No ledger explains why that particular sale outran the price of a dozen seasoned field hands, or why the purchaser immediately carried his prize 200 meters northwest into the Blue Ridge, and never again returned with her to civilized Virginia. The Commonwealth keeps a single leather-bound register of the transaction. 7 pages are missing, their absence a neat, surgical empty space. The remaining sheets only faintly stained by inverted ink. What could possibly have made one human life worth such an impossible sum? What secret lay inside that leather folder? A secret plantation owners whispered about in disbelieving tones for decades afterward. To answer that, we must first walk the city that produced the auction. Richmond, in the spring of 1857, was a city of tobacco and ceremony, its warehouses rising along the James like a line of silent fortresses. Broad, tree-shadowed streets led from the Jeffersonian capital down to market districts where fortunes shifted with the tide, and church bells marked the hours with a civility that often disguised brutality. The Exchange itself sat on Franklin Street, a Greek revival temple of commerce whose Doric columns promised permanence in a world fashioned on very different terms. About 38,000 people called Richmond home, their lives arranged in predictable geography. Merchants took the townhouses on Church Hill. Laboring men crowded the alleys near Shockoe Bottom. And the enslaved, numerous and essential, remained invisible in every official calculation. Among the city's names, the Havefields ran the largest tobacco works. The Gresham brothers commanded the river trade, and the auction houses, above all, set the rhythm of local economics, handling more than 12,000 sales a year. In that market, human beings were counted, catalogued, and exchanged as readily as hogsheads of tobacco. Thomas Fairmont ran the exchange with a templated cruelty. At 43, he had overseen more than 6,000 sales. His voice, well-practiced and precise, could wring the last cent from a reluctant bidder. He kept detailed leather ledgers, not merely prices, but marks, skills, quirks, defiant eyes, likely trouble, reads scripture, dangerous. From his office, he could watch the floor and measure a crowd's temper before the lot ever stepped forward. March 14th began like any other day. The morning's early lots were field hands from a bankrupt farm in Goochland County. 7 men and 3 women sold at steady, familiar rates. Fairmont moved through them with mechanical cadence, his inflection a signal to buyers that nothing unexpected would occur. The room held maybe 80 men, faces known from 100 prior sales. Then, at precisely 11:47 by the exchange clock, the side door opened and everything altered. 2 men entered, country-worn, their coats and boots stained with the dust of distant roads. Between them walked a woman who stopped the murmuring like a hand on a bell. She stood about 5.5 feet, erect despite iron manacles around her wrists. Her skin bore the long tan of outdoor work, and yet her hands were smooth. No calluses, no scarred knuckles, none of the marks that insist upon the bodies of laborers bound to the fields. Her dress was plain and clean. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun that revealed a face composed to the point of being uncanny. Her age might have been anywhere from 25 to 35, but it was her eyes that unsettled the room. They offered no pleading, no desperation. They betrayed no human resignation. They were empty of the emotions the crowd expected to find, and that absence registered like an accusation. Fairmont descended from his platform. He exchanged brief words with the escorts and examined papers drawn from a worn case. Those nearby later said his face paled, then flushed, then paled again. It was as if the documents forced him to recalibrate the air. He returned to his podium with an unfamiliar hesitance. "Gentlemen," he said, voice steadying, "we have before us an unusual lot. The seller wishes anonymity, which is their legal right under Virginia statute. Designated lot 37, no name provided, age estimated 30, origin undisclosed. No documented history of fieldwork, house service, or skilled trade." A man from the back shouted, impatient. "What's her value then, Fairmont? Why waste our morning?" Fairmont's jaw set. "Opening bid, $5,000. The room fell into a stunned silence. $5,000, an amount greater than the annual incomes of most present, equaled the cost of a prime breeding pair, 3 master blacksmiths, or enough hands to cultivate dozens of acres. For a single woman with no apparent trade, the figure read as madness. Someone protested, others laughed. But Fairmont did something he had not done in 20 years of sales. He opened the seller's folder and read aloud, words that turned skepticism into a slow, building anger. The attestation was sworn before a magistrate in Albemarle County on March 9th. The property designated Lot 37 possesses knowledge of significant value to parties concerned with matters of agriculture, commerce, and territorial development. It continued. The knowledge had been verified by demonstration to 3 independent witnesses, signatures and seals appended. The purchaser would receive, with the bill of sale, a sealed letter containing specific instructions for extracting said knowledge. Attempts to force disclosure by ordinary interrogation would fail. The property had been conditioned, by legal and effective means, to reveal information only under the circumstances set out in that sealed letter. The seller assumed no responsibility for consequences arising from improper handling of the property or failure to follow instructions. Whispers erupted, questions overlapping. What knowledge? What demonstration? What instructions? Fairmont raised his hand and read the final line with a gravity that hushed even the most vocal skeptics. "The opening bid remains $5,000. Do I hear $5,000? For a long time, no one spoke. Then a weathered hand rose at the back. A Western Virginia farmer, plain clothes and quieter expectations. $5,000, he said simply. A Richmond merchant answered with $5,500. And then, with a speed that made sense only in hindsight, the bidding took on a life of its own. 6,000, 7, 8.5. Men who had come to buy labor found themselves bidding on a claim they could not name, driven by the promise, sworn before a magistrate, of knowledge valuable enough to rewrite calculations of profit. The woman on the block said nothing. Her gaze sat beyond the assembled faces, fixed on an interior plane that none could reach. At 12,000, only 4 bidders remained. By 15, 2. The Western farmer and a man whose identity none could place. Face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Voice unusually calm given the sums he spoke. 16,000, said the farmer, voice cracking. 20,000, came the stranger's reply without hesitation. The crowd gasped. $20,000 exceeded the value of many working plantations. For a single human being, it was beyond reason. The farmer, his face a map of anger and loss, pushed through the milling men and walked out into March sunlight. The stranger produced a bank draft from a firm hand. a draft that made even Fairmont's practiced fingers tremble as he verified it. What followed was a ceremony of law. Signatures, witnesses, the courier sent to the Bank of Virginia. When the papers were formalized, Fairmont handed the man 2 items: a bill of sale stamped with the exchange seal and a sealed envelope bearing a wax impression of an unknown symbol. The buyer produced a key, unlocked her shackles with a practiced motion, and without another word, led her through the side door. She walked beside him with the same unnerving composure she had worn the entire morning, and together they vanished from sight, swallowed by the streets. In the days that followed, questions spread across Richmond like ink in water. The bank draft was traced to a livestock company registered in Staunton, over 100 miles northwest, whose listed warehouse had been empty for years. The magistrate named in the attestation could not be found, though his courthouse seal proved genuine. The 3 witnesses the seller claimed had verified the demonstration were invisible to inquiry. The woman who sold for $20,000, the woman everyone would come to call Lot 37, was never seen in Richmond again. Thomas Fairmont closed the exchange for 3 days, citing sudden illness. When he reopened, he refused to speak of the sale, deflecting all questions to his attorney. His ledger entry for March 14th filled a full page, an unusual detail in his typically concise record-keeping. But when curious hands sought to study it, they found a neat blank. 7 sequential pages had been removed so precisely that only the faintest impressions of reversed ink remained on the remaining sheets. Rumor fed on rumor. Some whispered of buried Confederate gold, a claim that made no chronological sense, the war still 4 years away. Others imagined stolen ledgers that could ruin families. A tavern keeper swore he had heard the woman speak a language no one could identify. Above all, talk clustered around that sealed letter and the instructions it promised. A ritual, a darkness, a sequence of questions and answers that would force disclosure, if followed exactly. 3 men had collapsed the day of the sale. One, a tobacco factor, quickly recovered and left as if nothing had happened. Another, a riverboat captain, withdrew to his study and refused visitors for a week. The third was carried out by friends and vanished from Richmond society. A ghost. His later sightings described by gossip as a man with white hair and trembling hands whenever Lot 37 was named. 6 weeks later, a reporter named Charles Whitfield, known for his stubbornness, set to work. He found sealed records in Albemarle, an empty warehouse whose boarded windows had fresh scratches, and neighbors who refused to speak. The trail froze until an anonymous letter arrived at the dispatch, postmarked from a mountain town. Its 3 sentences read less like information than a threat. The knowledge she carries could redraw maps. Some borders exist only in men's minds. Stop searching before you learn which category you occupy. Whitfield published a careful piece. No conclusions, no names beyond what was public. And then, 3 days later, he did not show for work. His room stood as if he'd gone for a walk and never returned. His bank account showed no withdrawals. 6 weeks of investigation produced nothing. The case was quietly closed, and Whitfield joined the growing list of people connected to Lot 37 who simply ceased to exist in any verifiable way. The war that followed folded Richmond inward, turning its commerce into strategy and its markets into marching orders. The exchange became a depot, its auction floor a place for billets and crates rather than ledgers. Reconstruction left the building hollow for a time, its records boxed and carted to basements where dust gathered over transactions that some preferred to forget. Thomas Fairmont died in 1869, His estate passed to a nephew who sold the exchange to a textile concern. The nephew later admitted, in private gossip and over drinks, that he had found among his uncle's effects a locked iron box. Fairmont's will had instructed that the box be thrown, unopened, into the James. The nephew complied. He later told friends it had felt dense as lead when he hefted it, but no one ever learned what it contained. A sealed curiosity consigned to river deep. Memory, however, is a stubborn thing. In October 1873, a former Confederate officer named Daniel Vaughan published a memoir of wartime days. Among his campaign sketches and hospital recollections, he tucked a sentence that refused to be ordinary. He had overheard two old men in a Richmond convalescent ward, and one said the buyer knew exactly what he was purchasing. He had been searching for 3 years. When he found her, price became irrelevant. He would have paid $50,000 if necessary. Vaughan's aside landed like a pebble in a pond. It was small, easily missed, but when a historian years later followed its rings, those ripples widened. Margaret Holloway found them. By 1891, she had already carved a reputation drilling into inconvenient corners of Virginia's past. A footnote in Vaughan's memoir, the mention of $20,000, snagged her attention. She knew professionally how aberrant that number was. Aberrations conceal patterns, she believed. She began to dig. The Richmond records that had been sequestered during Reconstruction were accessible only with persistence, and Holloway had the kind of persistence that prefers solitude to applause. In a courthouse basement, under lamplight and in a room smelling of old paper, she found Fairmont's ledgers. The March 14th entry sat where the sequence expected it, and the missing 7 pages were obvious, a neat gap in a neat book. But the margins yielded ghosts. Holding the pages at precise angles, Holloway made out faint impressions, fragmented phrases, Western survey marks, ridge line above seam, 3-foot depth. They read not like personal description, but like geological shorthand. She traveled to Staunton, where the warehouse named in the bank draft had once stood. The building was gone, changed into other uses, its transfer records a chain of brief owners, each address leading to another county and then another attorney who had moved away. Small dead ends became a pattern. In Albemarle County, she found, in April of 1857, a record she would not forget. A purchase of 240 acres near Swift Run Gap, paid by a buyer listed only as J. Marlowe, agent. The legal description did not speak of hedgerows and oaks. It spoke of mineral realities. Bounded on the north by granite outcrop bearing survey mark 1749, on the south by creek branch following limestone formation, on east by ridgeline above coal seam exposure. The language belonged to men who read rock the way others read ledgers. By December, Holloway had a guide, Samuel Fletcher, a born mountain man who knew hollows the maps forgot. He led her up a narrow track to a cabin site so reclaimed the forest seemed embarrassed at its memory. Chimney stones jutted from rot. A well shaft lay carefully boarded, and across a clearing the ground bore depressions, 14 distinct excavation sites, ranging from shallow test pits to one that fell away like a wound. Fletcher told the story his father had told him. The man who called himself Marlowe had arrived with a woman, kept to themselves for 3 years, hired locals for careful digging, and always kept the woman nearby. She would stand on ridgelines and point. Men who dug where she indicated found coal seams, iron ore, stone useful for building. Always something of value. The men who worked for Marlowe never spoke to her directly. Marlowe dealt with the world. She dealt with where things lay. Holloway examined the well. It had been sealed with clay in a manner suggesting preservation rather than mere hygiene. Fletcher said Marlowe used it to store ore samples, canvas sacks lowered and raised in ritual. The shaft's mortarwork spoke of tools and hands trained to true lines. The dig sites, when plotted, traced a path parallel to the ridge but offset, the telltale map of a subsurface seam. Near the ruins, a flat stone bore numbers and symbols like the shorthand of a surveyor. Holloway copied them into her notebook, feeling the kind of chill that comes when scattered facts begin to arrange themselves into an answer. Back in Richmond, Holloway kept pulling threads. The Virginia Geological Survey's dusty archives yielded a manuscript that changed everything. Field journals from an 1847 expedition led by William Barton Rogers, the same Rogers who would later found MIT. In a passage dated July 23, 1847, Rogers praised a Negro woman, property of Colonel Thaddeus Hargrove of Albemarle County, a woman who demonstrated unexpected facility for geological observation. Though illiterate, Rogers noted, she possessed an eidetic memory, a facility for recognizing formations across disparate sites. She worked with the survey party for months. Her contributions accelerated their map-making. Holloway traced Hargrove's estate papers. The colonel died in 1853. Inventories listed a number of enslaved people but few names. The ledger, as ever, was silent when it mattered most. But Rogers's notation suggested a path. The woman had been with trained geologists, learned professional observation at their side, and left the encounter carrying a knowledge that could be wielded like a tool. Other hints stitched themselves to Rogers's note. An 1848 survey report referred briefly to the Hargrave woman as someone whose services would be valuable. A 1849 letter requested permission to hire an enslaved woman with demonstrated geological aptitude for a Kentucky expedition. By 1892, Holloway had assembled a trajectory. A woman gleaned training from official expeditions, then became a commodity whose value would be auctioned openly in Richmond. The investigation drew resistance. Records disappeared. Courthouse pages were lost in fires that spared other documents. Tax rolls went inexplicably missing. Then came a thin, threatening letter to Holloway in Baltimore. Abandon the inquiry and a name would be revealed. Continue and she would discover why some secrets remain buried. Whoever watched her had time and resources, and they did not want sunlight. A man named Robert Denore found Holloway before fear did. He arrived looking every inch the man who had once worked the field and then the mine. He spoke with a miner's laconic specificity. He had seen her work, he said, in 1856, hired for a week by a surveying company. She could read a landscape, Denore told Holloway. Stand her on a ridge and she would say, "Dig here 8 feet, and there would be coal." She was never wrong. Companies sought to hire her permanently. Her owner refused. But word rippled. The mining world recognized that someone with such faculty could topple fortunes. Denore gave a name to the buyer whom Fairmont recorded as Marlowe. He told Holloway the man was likely James Pritchard, a speculator who made a trade of buying mineral rights and reselling them. Pritchard, Denore said, would have paid $50,000 if he had needed to. He paid $20,000 and took the woman into the mountains. For 3 years she guided surveys, and Pritchard's investments rewarded him handsomely. But Denore left Holloway with the detail that unsettled every ledger she had examined. After the sale, the woman looked back at the assembled buyers and said, "You have purchased knowledge, but knowledge requires payment beyond gold." Then she walked away with her buyer. Denore had never forgotten those words. Margaret Holloway never finished the grand account she intended to publish. Threats broadened into obfuscation, leads burned out. Her notes, meticulous and patient, ended incomplete when she died in 1903. The research, however, lay like a smoldering coal in archives, awaiting those who would tend it. Decades later, a graduate student named Thomas Edgerton followed the trail into another archive and found a private memoir by William Barton Rogers, where Rogers confessed to having recognized the woman's gifts and, in an act of frustrated humanity, to having attempted to purchase her freedom. He recorded the woman's name, or at least the name he had used for her, Anna. Rogers wrote that Colonel Hargrove had grown furious when his wife's illicit teaching came to light. She had been punished by the sale of other women, but Anna was kept because her value was too great to sacrifice. Rogers remembered Anna thanking him in Latin when their expedition ended, a small, private gratitude that sounded then like the echo of a life constrained. Edgerton's later work assembled fragments that formed a startling portrait. Anna, perhaps educated covertly in Hargrove's library, perhaps trained by exposure during survey expeditions, or perhaps blessed with an uncanny visual memory, was nonetheless real in her expertise. Records indicated she later worked as a consultant in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, operating in roles unprecedented for any woman of her race in that century. She had accumulated knowledge, then used it quietly, precisely, to fracture the fortunes of men who had profited from her as property. The sealed letter read at auction, the one Fairmont recited with such theatricality, may have been her own condition, a warning more than a method. Respect and fair recompense were not merely moral goods. Failure to observe them had consequences. But even as the story coalesced, questions remained sharp as a miner's chisel. Who had sold her in Richmond, and why? Who erased ledger pages and burned county records? What did the missing 7 pages contain that Fairmont needed to keep from daylight? And when Anna whispered that knowledge demands payment beyond gold, what price did she intend to collect? The mountain sites remained, 14 small scars in the earth, a sealed well, the flat stone of surveying marks, and in those marks, the outlines of an answer could be traced. Still, the ledger, the sealed envelope, the men whose faces collapsed that March morning, and the quiet, bitter campaigns Anna is said to have waged after emancipation, leave the question unresolved in a way history likes. It furnishes evidence, but it cannot name the human interior that made those events possible. What it can show is that knowledge, acquired under constraint and treated as commodity, shapes futures in ways coin never can. Anna's bargain with the world was not merely a sale at an auction block. It was a ledger of retribution recorded in seams and shafts, a slow accounting that history could not entirely erase. If you would like to continue, the next part will follow Anna beyond the mountains, into the mines, the letters, the calculated collapses of empires built on her labor, and into the stubborn late echo of a woman who turned stolen knowledge into a kind of justice. In the years that followed her disappearance into the Blue Ridge, Anna's name, or the absence of it, drifted through the margins of documents like a shadow that refused to resolve into form. What little survived came through the work of those who, decades afterward, felt compelled to trace the outline of a life that official records had nearly swallowed. Of these, no researcher pressed deeper than Thomas Edgerton, the graduate student who uncovered Rogers's memoir in 1947 and realized, with a kind of breathless certainty, that the unnamed woman in the Richmond Exchange was the same unnamed woman who had once walked the ridgelines with Rogers's survey party. A single identity stretched across 2 worlds, one of shackles, one of geological maps. Egerton's reconstruction of Anna's later life relied on fragments so thin they might have collapsed under incorrect handling. But when placed together, the fragments formed the unmistakable silhouette of a mind that refused confinement. According to company ledgers preserved in Pittsburgh, a woman matching Anna's description appeared there late in 1860, employed not as a laborer or domestic, but as a technical consultant for a manufacturer of mining equipment. The position itself was unprecedented for anyone of her gender, much less her race or origin. Yet the language used in those ledgers, brief, bureaucratic, but careful, suggested respect. Her expertise was not doubted. Her judgment was not questioned. She remained there 3 years. Long enough, Egerton concluded, to earn wages substantial enough to buy her legal freedom in the chaotic flexibility of wartime. Long enough, too, to learn who had profited from her in the years before the Richmond sale, and how to undo them. Philadelphia received her next, a city of industry and anonymity, well suited for a woman who had no interest in being found. Business directories from 1864 onward list an A. Hargrove, geological consultant, a professional title so rare at the time it nearly shuddered under its own audacity. Whether she chose the surname as bitter tribute or as camouflage, Egerton could not determine. But the choice itself contained a story, a life built out of letters once used to claim ownership over her. In Philadelphia, she built a career that operated like a scalpel. According to correspondence Egerton recovered, Anna kept records, not merely geological ones, but records of men. Survey companies that rented her abilities, plantation owners who sold or hired her labor, businesses that circulated rumors of her value. After emancipation, she used her knowledge to slice into their foundations one by one. Not openly, not visibly, but with a precision that resembled slow, exacting vengeance. Mining companies that had once prospered from her predictions found themselves underpriced by newer firms. Firms quietly advised by the woman whose signature no ledger had recorded during her years of bondage. 3 of the most successful companies associated with her enslaved expertise collapsed into bankruptcy between 1865 and 1869. These collapses, according to Egerton, showed patterns consistent with insider knowledge deployed at moments of maximum impact. And always, just below the last line of an account or the corner of a survey report, initials appeared. A.H. The final act in Anna's Long Shadow War played out in Pennsylvania's coal country. By 1869, James Pritchard, the man who had called himself J. Marlowe, the man who unlocked her shackles on the day of her sale, had become an industrial figure of some renown. He had built an empire on mineral rights she identified for him in the mountains, an empire of seams and shafts and the coaxed wealth of the earth. His downfall, when it came, unfolded with a smooth inevitability that suggested planning. Pritchard had sought to hire a geological consultant for his newest acquisition, a tract of coal-rich land in central Pennsylvania. He sent inquiries. Anna accepted. If Pritchard recognized her, no record shows it. People do not look closely at those they once believed they owned. She surveyed the tract. She delivered her report, and Pritchard invested everything. The coal lay exactly where she said it would. But coal is not merely coal. Within weeks of digging, miners noticed the sulfur reek, the brittle quality, the discoloration that marked the seams as commercially useless. A property worthless for sale, worthless for transport, worthless for fire. By the time Pritchard understood, the land had already consumed him. Creditors stripped his holdings with the same speed he had once stripped mountains. He died impoverished in 1874, his empire reduced to ash. Anna, as always, left no explanation. Edgerton believed she lived at least until 1892, traveling between contracts, appearing and vanishing like a migratory current. She never married, never rooted herself, never allowed her name to thicken in public record. A ghost that breathed, calculating where next to direct her knowledge and what debts remained unpaid. The story might have ended there. Scattered testimonies, an unfinished article, echoes of a life almost unseen. If not for the discovery that returned the sealed letter to its rightful author. The letter, the one Fairmont read aloud at the exchange, had fascinated every researcher who touched the case. Some imagined it contained a ritual, a coded instruction for compelling the woman to speak. But Edgerton found, through a descendant of the estate executor who sold her, a near verbatim transcription. 3 sentences only. This woman possesses knowledge acquired through means that violated Virginia law. She will share that knowledge only if treated with respect and compensated fairly. Fail in either obligation, and you will find that knowledge can be a weapon more devastating than any physical force. These were not conditions for extracting information. These were boundaries, a warning written in the voice of someone who had already learned the cost of letting others determine her worth. Anna had dictated those words. She had forced them into the sale. It was her contract with the world, signed under the pretense of being an object. Edgerton's 1950 dissertation told this full story, or as much of it as could be excavated. The academic world received it politely, cautiously, a footnote to larger histories, a quiet correction to loud narratives. But for the few who read it deeply, those who studied labor, science, the unseen intelligence of the enslaved, the dissertation became bedrock. It showed unmistakably that the intellectual labor of enslaved people had shaped American industry in ways no record books acknowledged. That knowledge acquired in secret, in fear, in defiance, could not be contained by those who claimed ownership of the body that carried it, and that even after freedom, the world could require silence from a woman who had earned full voice. The Richmond Exchange building fell to demolition in 1953, its stones carried off to make room for asphalt. No marker stands to say that a miracle of intelligence stood once on its auction block. The ledgers survive in storage, their missing pages still missing. The mountain cabin rotted, swallowed by forest. The sealed well remains a curiosity hikers sometimes mention in passing. And yet the traces endure, in seams opened where she pointed, in companies undone by miscalculation, in the faint, ringed pressure of ink on paper stripped away long ago. Margaret Holloway's unfinished article was discovered by a niece in 1904. Attached was a note written in Holloway's careful hand. Some stories resist conclusion because their meaning continues beyond any ending I can provide. She never again researched enslavement. The year she abandoned the project, 1892, was the year Anna appears for the last time in any known directory. Robert Denor's private notes, found after his death, contained a question he wrote 3 weeks before the end. Did she possess supernatural ability, or only the brilliance we refuse to see? It is a question that lives between the lines of every fragment recovered. Modern geologists who have studied her sites say nothing supernatural was required, only an eye trained by relentless observation, eidetic memory, a mind unbound by the constraints that bound her body. But brilliance, real brilliance, in the hands of an enslaved woman was treated, in 1857, as something unnatural. And anything unnatural must either be owned or destroyed. What remains of her story persists not in ledgers or court filings, but but in the knowledge that the world tried to bury her mind and failed. She walked into the mountains with a man who believed he owned her. She walked out of history under her own name, a name she chose on her terms, leaving debts paid behind her, paid in full. If you followed her story this far, then you understand why the past still trembles around her. Knowledge requires payment beyond gold, and Anna understood exactly how to collect. When you're ready, we'll continue together into another forgotten corner of history, another place where a quiet truth waited decades for someone to listen.